This is the beginning of Old Filth. He was spectacularly clean. You might say ostentatiously clean. His ancient fingernails were rimmed with purest white. The few still gold hairs below his ankles, no, I beg your pardon, below his knuckles, looked always freshly shampooed, as did his curly, still bronze hair. His shoes shone like conkers. His clothes were always freshly pressed. He had the elegance of the 1920s, for his garments, whatever they looked like off, always became him. Always a Victorian silk handkerchief in his breast pocket, always yellow cotton or silk socks from Harrods, and some still perfect from his old days in the East. His skin was clear, and in a poor light, young. His colleagues at the bar called him Filth, but not out of irony. It was because he was considered to be the source of the old joke, failed in London, try Hong Kong. It was said that he had fled the London bar very young, very poor, on a sudden whim, just after the war, and had done magnificently well in Hong Kong from the very start. Being a modest man, they said, he had called himself a parvenu, a fraud, a carefree spirit. Filth, in fact, was no great maker of jokes. He was not at all modest about his work, and seldom, except in great extremity, went in for whims. He was loved, however, admired, laughed at kindly, and still much discussed many years after his retirement. Now nearing 80, he lived alone in Dorset. His wife Betty was dead, but he often prattled on to her around the house. Astonishingly, in one so old, his curly hair was not yet grey. His eyes and mind alert, he was a delightful man. He had always been thought so, a man whose distinguished life had run steadily and happily. There was no smell of old age about his house. He was rich and took for granted that it and he would be kept clean, fed and laundered by servants, as it had always been. He knew how to treat servants, and they stayed with him for years. Betty had been successful with servants too. Both she and Old Filth had been born in what Americans call the Orient, and the British Raj had called the Far East. They knew who they were, but they were unself-conscious and popular. After Betty's death, the self-mockery dwindled in Old Filth. His life exploded. He became more ponderous. He began, at first slowly, to flick open shutters on the past that he had, as a sensible man with sensible and learned friends, he was a QC and had been a judge, had kept clamped down. His success as an advocate in Hong Kong had been phenomenal, for he had ease, grasp, diligence and flair. His career had taken off the minute he had begun to be briefed by the Straits Chinese. It was not just that scraps of Eastern languages began to re-emerge from his childhood in Malaya, but a feeling of nearness to the Oriental mind. When Old Filth spoke Malay, when Old Filth spoke Malay, or less ably Mandarin, you heard an unsuspected voice. Chinese, Malay and Bengali lawyers, though often trained at Oxford and the Inns of Court, were thought to be not straightforward. But Filth, now Old Filth, and after his retirement, often dear Old Filth, had found them perfectly straightforward and to his taste. All his life he kept a regard for Chinese values, the courtesy, the sudden thrust, the holiness of hospitality, the pleasure in money, the decorum, the importance of food, the discretion, the cleverness. He had married a Scotswoman, but she had been born in Peking. She was dumpy and tweedy with broad Lanarkshire shoulders and square hands, but she spoke Mandarin perfectly and was much more at home with Chinese ways and idiom than she ever had felt on her very rare visits to Scotland. Her passion for jewellery was Chinese, and her strong Scottish fingers rattled the trays of jade in the street markets of Kowloon, stirring the stones like pebbles on a beach. When you do that, old Filth would say, when they were young and he was still aware of her all the time, when you do that, your eyes are almond-shaped. Poor old Betty, he would say to her, ghost across in another armchair in the house in Dorset, to which they had retired and in which she had died. And why ever Dorset? Nobody knew. Some family tradition somewhere, perhaps? Filth said it was because he disliked everywhere else in England. Betty because she felt the cold in Scotland, and they were both a bit dismissive towards Wales. But if any old pair had been born to become retired expats in Hong Kong, members of the cricket club, the jockey club, the stalwarts of the English Lending Library, props of St Andrew's Church and St John's Cathedral, they were Filth and Betty. People who would always be able to keep servants. Filth was very rich. Who would live in a house on the Peak, forever welcoming hosts of to every friend of a friend's friend who was visiting the colony. When you thought of Betty, you saw her at her round rosewood dining table, looking quickly about her to see if plates were empty, tinkling her little bell to summon the snaky, smiling girls in their household livery of identical cheongsams. Old Filth and Betty were perfectly international people, beloved ornaments at every one of the memorial services to old friends, English or Chinese, in the cathedral. In the last years, these deaths had been falling thick and fast upon them. Was it perhaps the pound that drew them to Dorset? The thought of having to survive one day in Hong Kong on a pension? But the part of Dorset they had chosen was far from cheap. Betty was known to have her own money, and Filth had always said merrily that he had put off making judge for as long as possible so that he hadn't to live on a salary. And they had no children, no responsibilities, no one to come back to England for. Or was it, the most likely thing, was it the end of empire, the drawing near of 1997? Was it the unbearableness of the thought of the arrival of the barbarians, the now unknown but certainly changed mainland Chinese, whose grandparents had fed the baby Miss Betty on soft, cloudy jellies and told her frightening fairy tales?